The wide receiver free agency landscape is what we are diving into today on RotoViz Overtime. I'm going to be joined by Kevin Szafraniec. We're going to talk through, I think, some really interesting names as to where they could land ahead of the 2025 season. Obviously, there's franchise tags. There's people could be contract negotiations, trades, and so on and so forth. Lots of ways this could change over the course of the coming weeks and months. But there is quite a number of names. Obviously, Tee Higgins being the kind of headline candidate, but there is other players I think that are going to be very fantasy relevant heading into this season, whether they can be back on the roster that they've been on or whether they move around and be in a different location. So I'm looking forward to getting Kevin's thoughts on a recently posted piece up on rotoviz.com where he kind of previewed some of the free agency moves, and maybe we'll get his thoughts on where he would like to see some of these guys land. Kevin, how are you feeling as we get ready to dissect some of these wide receivers and maybe creatively adjust into some landing spots and get excited here?
Yeah, I'm feeling great. I mean, I love the off season. I guess a lot of speculation. It lets the mind kind of go wild. You get the galaxy brain going.
I think you can really get into the we talk about like fantasy football. Well, you can like fantasize about what you want to happen at this point. This is the point where everything is possible.
Yeah, and then be let down when nothing goes the way. Oh yeah, super excited. I did a whole series about position by position going through free agency, and it's not just the players scheduled to be free agents, but also looking at cut candidates and trade candidates too. So that was a lot of fun, just kind of looking into who might change teams, and I think obviously wide receivers is of the most interest to us. There's some big names that could possibly change, and we're already hearing about Cooper Kupp is essentially not going to be a Ram next year, no matter what. So
there's going to be a lot of moving pieces, and I think you get the different dominoes that will start to fall. We'll see. Obviously the Rams are going to likely want to move on from Kupp ahead of the NFL draft. Similarly, we've seen with the Browns and their star rusher wanting to get to a different destination. So that a lot of these teams are going to want to have those moves made, get the draft capital now, and be able to know what the situation is. It's going to be very, very intriguing. But Tee Higgins, somebody who has been, I don't think there's ever really been a question from even his detractors about Tee Higgins' ability and what he kind of possesses in terms of his elite traits for a wide receiver. He's obviously been paired now with one of the potentially best of all time kind of level tier of wide receiver in Jamar Chase, which maybe takes some of the shine off him at times in terms of the shine off Tee Higgins. We see him come up clutch in a number of big games down the stretch again this year for the Bengals, including in the playoffs. What were some of the things that you highlighted from Higgins's, I guess, the pros and cons towards him? Do you think there's much chance that he ends up back with the Bengals? And then I guess we'll answer those questions before we get into some dream landing spots. I've noticed on YouTube recently, anytime that Tee Higgins has talked about, the comments keep mentioning he has to end up with the Washington Commanders. But what's your thoughts here on Tee Higgins, his outlook for moving on? And then are we always going to be capped at the flashes? Like this season, for example, he had 4 games where he's, in the 20 plus or higher, basically range. 18.2 is one of those games, but there's a 29-point game, a 29-point game, and a 42-point game, as I mentioned, against the Broncos. But then you do have those weeks, where he's in your lineup, but he's hurting your team. But what it felt like down the stretch from kind of week 11 onwards was even the weeks where he didn't have massive performances, he was in the high teens in terms of 17 or 19 points rather than those low single digit numbers. I think a lot of people the one thing that comes into people's minds with Higgins is when he has even been active in recent years, where he has technically been injured but active, and they've kind of held him out of those games, and he's really affected people and their chances to win on that particular week. So Higgins as a dynasty hold has been tough from that perspective, but I think that has carried over into people's thoughts of him when it comes to assessing him for redraft season long and so on as well.
Yeah, and it's I mean, we're not obviously NFL GMs, so they do a lot of things that I don't necessarily understand sometimes. Like, so Higgins, the Bengals do have enough cap space. They have about 44 million in effective cap space for this offseason. And Higgins on Spot Track, he's projected to get a contract in the $25 million a year range. But I've also read in other places that people are projecting to be more around 30 million a year. So obviously it makes sense that they could bring him back. But then you also, factor in, Jamar Chase is going to be looking for, after last year, trying to do his like unprecedented, like 2-year before his contract's up, he tried to do that, held off. He's going to get it this offseason. I can't imagine. And, with especially how bad their defense was, just like it doesn't seem like they have the luxury really of giving Tee Higgins 30 million a year on top of everything else. But I mean, I thought that in the past with other teams, and then just kind of been, it's some like it comes down.
It feels like they're going to have to make a decision at some point. Like, we can't keep both of these guys, and the realistic one is that you keep Chase no matter what. So I think, and I think he's going to be the focus of their off-season negotiations this off-season as well, which again will hinder Higgins. And I think Higgins, unless he took a little bit of a discount to stay with Cincinnati, I think his market is going to be massive. Like he could potentially reset the market himself by going through free agency and moving to a different organization.
Yeah, and it seems like the free agent class this year is a little weak. There's no superstar names. I don't think anybody might would really consider Higgins like a superstar. He's a good wide receiver 2. I'm kind of interested to see what he would be like in a wide receiver 1 role. That's why, you mentioned the Commanders. I think even like a 1A, 1B situation would probably be ideal for him. But I mean, and you did mention really his biggest thing has been on the field, and he's kind of burned some fantasy managers that way. So maybe some people have a sour taste in their mouth. And this year was no different. But he was the wide receiver 4 in PPR points per game when he was on the field, and you mentioned like the huge 42-point game that he had, but across, the entirety of the season, he had 3 games that he was under, 10 points, wide receiver 1, 33% of the time, wide receiver 2, 25% of the time. So he does have kind of the boomer bust profile, but the bust might not be as bad maybe as we think. But I also don't think that he's necessarily like a superstar wide receiver 1. I think, at most he might be better in a situation where there's somebody else in that offense that could, pull the defensive attention away from him. Like going to like Las Vegas would probably, I mean, obviously Bowers is there, but as far as wide receiver 1A and B, I don't think that would be like maybe the ideal spot for him. Something like
think,
that.
And I'm a Tee Higgins kind of stan, but like I think that he's not in the tier of the Jefferson Chase. Like he's not in that level, but there are very few people who are anywhere near that or get to that or have the same kind of spike upside. He has shown that he has that upside, but if he can be healthy and be the focal point of the offense, like if you imagine like he's sharing huge chunks of potential targets every single week with Jamar Chase, which is, going to get the focal point of the offense. I think there's a huge opportunity for him post free agency here to be undervalued when we're heading into the next fantasy season, based on what I mentioned with people potentially being hurt by past kind of infatuations with Tee Higgins. I think that, and for his best interest, he should go test free agency and get as much money as he obviously can. And I think that'll be what obviously happens in the end. The difficult part of that is you mentioned like the Raiders. And when you mentioned the Raiders, I'm like, not as excited if we're on the Raiders. But then if if the quarterback situation is changed in a slightly different direction, that would make that landing spot quite appealing. But you can kind of picture the situations when you say Washington, well, Terry McLaurin and him in that offense, like how does that change that around? And how does it open things up? But I think that Higgins' upside is as huge as like getting that chance to be the alpha target hog in an offense. Like I think that he has the ability to, pretty much do everything. But then if that was carried by, 12 to 14 targets on a weekly basis, I think there's a ceiling that could still be tapped into there. But yeah, the Commanders, I think, is a fun potential landing spot from him. The other one that you've mentioned here, is the Patriots. He's been linked with the Patriots for quite some time. I think pairing him with somebody like Drake May could be a huge amount of fun. But I just like what we've seen with Jaden Daniels as a rookie. I think we just all want, the Commanders to lavish him up with elite talent and see what happens then. But yeah, the part you mentioned is it's not really a headliner free agency class. So you have Tee Higgins, and even as a player who you would say is, potentially still in his prime, maybe entering his prime, he's just turned 26. He's still like, a little bit older than when we're looking through this group. And then like you look at some of the other names, it's Stephon Diggs coming back from his injuries, Chris Godwin, who was having a really strong season, but then picked up the injury coming back from that. He was averaging 19.7 points per game prior to that injury. And that, his season looked to be just on a tear to kick things off down there with Baker Mayfield. But he has to deal with that when he's coming back. We have Keenan Allen, who did put up some really big games, but had a difficult situation in Chicago, where like 67% of the time he was a wide receiver 3 or less, a lot of single-digit games, had 4 huge games throughout the course of the season. But it's a little bit tricky when we're looking down through the list and, players then when we see Deontay Johnson, who went from, somebody who was setting himself up to have a huge contract situation to somebody now who is probably hoping that he can latch onto a roster somewhere. So those other names that I mentioned, there's intrigue with them. Chris Godwin, is somebody who I've always liked as well. But the injury is a tough one to battle back from, then walking into a free agency situation. Out of those names, or maybe even some of the names that are in the article that I haven't mentioned, maybe we'll not get into the trade candidates just yet, but who are you liking from that list?
It's kind of hard to, with all you mentioned, all the red flags kind of for each player. It's either age or, I don't ever remember any other player coming back from a dislocated ankle. So Chris Godwin's injury, it's like a huge question mark, and I hope that he does come back and he doesn't, miss a ton of or lose a lot of, his burst or any of the talent that he had before. But even when he came back from his ACL a couple of years ago, it took him at least like a year or so to really start getting back to where, and he finally seemed like he was back this year where he was the wide receiver 2 before he got injured. So obviously excited about Godwin. I'm excited. Diggs is a hard one to really get excited about. ACL at age 31, 32 isn't really ideal for a wide receiver. Allen, I'm still holding out some hope for Keenan Allen because his skill set's never been predicated on athleticism. So I don't think he's going to be back with Chicago next year. And I think, even last year when he was a trade candidate, like the Ravens, he seems like a Ravens player, he maybe takes a discount trying to win a championship. I think that I guess that's just my wish list. We were talking about wish lists or the fantasy part of fantasy football. Keenan Allen to the Ravens, I think, would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, you mentioned, the age of some of these guys. Keenan Allen will be 33 in April. You look at Chris Godwin, he's obviously coming back, but he's going to be 29 in February. And you're working through these injuries, but they all are kind of players who I think you could see in situations as their game evolves as kind of like, not exclusively like chain movers or like red zone weapons, but kind of players who are like trying to get you those 12 to 13 yards. You're not necessarily looking for them to like take the roof off at any point. I think they're probably beyond that even prior to these injury situations for Godwin and Diggs, but similarly with Allen. But we did see some flashes with Allen, but that leads you into like the overall group. Obviously we're recording this prior to the Super Bowl, but you have Hopkins heading there, but Amari Cooper heading into free agency. But then you get some of the names like, the possible trade candidates, and one of them who, their game is predicated a little bit like Keenan Allen, mainly on, technique, right running and so on, but has shown some speed this year that I didn't think would still be there. That was Davante Adams, who had a strong stretch, from week 14 onwards with a couple of wide receiver 1 games in there after he got his mid-season trade from the Raiders to the Jets. Cooper Kupp, though, and then Deebo Samuel as all potential trade candidates. I think that the one probably that makes the most sense to start off with here is probably Cooper Kupp, because it seems like he's definitely on the move. But we're into veteran territory where teams maybe won't want to take on certain contracts, and that could limit some of the landing spots. What are your hopes for maybe some of your favorite potential trade candidates here? And any of them for you that are like, some of the underlying metrics are showing that maybe teams should take a chance on these guys?
Well, I mean, there's a reason that they're all trade candidates, doing the wide receiver advanced stats wrap up. None of them really popped, honestly. I mean, obviously Cooper Kupp had that big like 20 target game right at the beginning of this season when Puka got hurt in week 1. But I mean, I think they've been telling us all season long that they are that maybe the state of his athleticism has been declining because he's just been a trade candidate, all year. I think the Rams have been telling us something. So not super excited about Cooper Kupp, honestly. Hope that, I mean, he's obviously a fun player. He's been, he had that Triple Crown season a few years back. So that was, he's a guy that you kind of want to root for, but I think he might just kind of be done. I've been sprinkling him in a little bit in early drafts, but overall not super excited about. I just feel like maybe he's at the end of his rope. Debo, I mean, he had some good, his, broken tackle percentage was really good this year, but he took a steep decline. I guess the biggest thing with Debo is, we saw him have a really inefficient season a few years back, and then he was able to bounce back in 2023 before, taking another dip in 2024 with his efficiency. So, I mean, he's getting kind of long in the tooth, and he's, he misses a lot of time with injuries because of his style of play. So he's another player I love watching Debo, but he's hard to kind of get on board with. Out of all of them, Davante, he's a lot like Keenan Allen, where his game isn't necessarily predicated on elite athleticism. So I think, like, to answer your question about the guy to be most excited about, I think Davante, might be that guy, especially if he stays with the Jets. It feels like if it's like him and Rodgers almost seem like a group deal. If Rodgers stays with the Jets, then Adams will probably be there. And I don't think that either of them will probably be there, especially because, I mean, the Jets can straight up just cut Davante. I think he has trade value, but his contract is it's upwards of like 30 million, over 30 million a year. But if they cut him before June 1st or trade him, they can get 29.8 million in cap savings. If they move him after June 1st, they get 36.1 million in cap savings. So for a team that doesn't really look like they're going anywhere, holding on to Davante Adams doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. So he's one of the names. And I'm assuming, if they do trade him, it's going to be like the Jets take on some of his salary and then also, split it between whoever they send him to. So he's a guy that I'm still maybe not at his ADP, I'm not super excited about, but he's also a guy that I don't think he's dust. I think he's still going to be productive. He's shown he can still do that. So,
yeah, I think there's a lot of teams around the league are waiting to see. They're hoping that maybe he gets cut. I think there's like a potential reunion there, even maybe with the Packers that has been like talked about, and Packers fans over the last couple of weeks, in terms of, we're going to talk a little bit about maybe what they need to do with their wide receiver position on an upcoming show with myself and Kevin. Kevin wrote some about the Packers and some of the drops issues over the course of this season. A player that you haven't added to the article that I'm going to pitch in here that I think is an interesting trade candidate this offseason, and that is DK Metcalf. You have mentioned Tyler Lockett, but I think that Metcalf could be somebody who, it's a bit like when you're setting up your dynasty stall and you're like, I would like to move, Tyler Lockett, but it's like the guy's like, well, you have this guy called DK Metcalf who's a bit better than Tyler Lockett. Could I have him, please? Which I think, again, when you're looking at trying to maximize their resources, this is probably the last chance you have to move on from somebody like a DK Metcalf. There's still enough flashes there. I think they're going to try and elevate JSN to that complete lead role heading into this season. But some of the cut candidates you have mentioned, Christian Kirk, Tyler Lockett, Alan Lazard. I think the Lazard one is a bit like we already talked with the Jets, like a veteran wide receiver like Lazard probably doesn't make sense to have on their roster. You have some fifth-year breakout potentials. What is your Which wide receiver here do you want to highlight from this kind of cohort of players?
I mean, just going back to some of Sean and Blair's research about fifth-year breakouts, I think it's something good to talk about because it's not really something that many people think about. I mean, it's not something I ever thought about before reading RotoViz. So I mean, Sean's initial fifth-year breakout articles were probably back in like 2021. And really the buckets that really matter for fifth-year breakouts is, changing team, drafted outside the top 50 picks, and obviously going into their fifth year. And a lot of times, obviously, that's when the four year rookie contract ends. So it just makes sense that they're trading or they're moving on to a different team. And in the article, I highlight Elijah Moore, Josh Palmer, Tutu Atwell, and Diami Brown as pretty much the guys that fit in those buckets. Moore was drafted inside the top 50 picks. So that really doesn't, he doesn't fit that bucket. But all the rest of the guys, they were drafted in the top 3 rounds, all of them. So they had some potential coming out of college, and maybe they just didn't hit where they maybe should have. And I mean, Elijah Moore and Diami Brown are the two that I really, really am interested in. Diami Brown popped in a lot of the metrics in the wrap up for this year, especially like evasion and yards after the catch. We kind of saw him come on down the stretch in the playoffs. He had some good games. And I know he was a guy that we were also really high on at the site when he came out of school. So those are the two of those 4 that I am really excited about, maybe seeing their landing spot and maybe seeing if they can emerge. But if going back, Sean did the fifth-year breakout, and Blair kind of followed it up with a little more like age-related analysis about prospects. So I mean, I think fifth-year breakouts or something like, obviously you think about somebody like Darnell Mooney last year, or Jerry Jeudy even was a fifth-year breakout last year.
Yeah.
So like those types of guys that kind of, these are the type of guys that everybody's kind of sick of. We've invested ADP, we've invested draft capital in them in our fantasy leagues, and they've burned us so many times that, we're kind of like done with them. But like, there's a proven track record that these guys are guys that we might want to take a chance on. And by now, like, their ADPs are so low that like, why not? Right.
I think Brown was somebody who you mentioned we were very high on when he came out of college. I often joke when we mention him that when myself and Sean came second in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament a couple of years ago, he was on that roster. We were hoping that maybe we'd have had a breakout in week 17. It didn't happen. But like, if you look throughout his career, there's really nothing there. But this year, there's about half of all his career numbers have occurred. And I thought there was a lot of that happening in those last kind of 6 weeks of the season where there was a lot to get excited about. So I am interested to see what happens to him in terms of, do they offer him something that keeps him there as part of that core in Washington, because they do need, like we already mentioned, could they get Tee Higgins, but they need pieces around him. The team is pretty bare bones outside of Terry McLaurin, and then you get the superstar quarterback. So we'll see what they do and what they maybe do to keep him. But if he moves on, I think I'm almost more excited for him if he's still with Washington, based on what we've seen down the stretch and how he was starting to evolve in that offense. But we'll see, maybe another team, takes him on. Like, he's probably, if he signs somewhere, he's going to be like a wide receiver 3 on the roster. I'd rather him almost be the wide receiver 3 for the Commanders and what their progression is here moving forward. But we will see what happens as we move forward. Kevin, anything you want to give us as we get ready to wrap up today's episode?
No, just, I mean, the rookie guide is really the big focus right now. Off-season primer series, that's kind of one. It's pretty near and dear to my heart because it's literally the first article series that I ever wrote for the site. So now just being back into it, it's good nostalgia for me to get back into that. I really enjoy kind of getting deep into team needs, and especially, I mean, one of the overlooked things that I really enjoy about that too is looking at coaching changes, whether it be head coaching or coordinators, because I just don't, maybe there's not enough eyes on, how much of a change really coaching changes can really bring to a team. Yeah, an impact. Yeah. How much impact really coaching changes, especially, a changing coordinator, can bring to a team. So that's something that I really like to dive into on those articles, because, it could change the whole entire scope of, how a player performs in the upcoming season. So we'll be just looking into that and just keep rolling and say the offseason never stops, right?
Never stops. So we'll be continuing on. I can tell that Kevin loves when I, just drop in these things as we record these shows sometimes in bulk. I'm like, Kevin, anything you've got left to say? And Kevin's like, I don't know when this episode's coming out, so I'm not 100% sure what I should be saying now. But that is where we are going to leave this one. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky at Overtime Ireland. You can follow Kevin on Twitter at TheCatDadFF. Am I correct? I can never remember if it's FF at the start or the end, but we get it right. We get a clean okay from Kevin there to finish it up. That is where we are going to leave it. Until we are back, have a good one.